Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast. Today, we're very excited to be sitting down with two individuals who have worked on a great new book, which we're recommending to our audience to take a look at. It really dives deep into a really fascinating aspect of architectural history and American history that deserves a lot of attention and interest. And what we're talking about is women architects at work making American modernism. And we're talking with two historians, Dr. Marianne Hunting and Dr. Kevin D. Murphy. Marianne is an architectural historian and has published previously on modernism, published a piece on a work, I should say, not just a piece, but on Edward Durell Stone, modernism's populist architect. And Dr. Kevin Murphy is the Andrew Mellon Chair in the Humanities and Professor and Chair in the Department of History and Art and Architecture at Vanderbilt. So two perfectly suited individuals to have this conversation with, who have joined forces to publish this really fascinating and deeply illustrated work. That's what appealed to my preservation eyes most, is it's just richly illustrated. There's 74 color illustrations, 88 black and white, and just a lot of detail and a lot of visual interest in this book. So before we get there, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to and how they were drawn to the fields that they work in. And here in the field of architectural history, we have obviously Marianne and Kevin. And so we're going to start with Marianne, and then we'll head over to Kevin. But the question we often ask is, how did you kind of get involved in all of this, and what led you into the field of architectural history?
I think I got there a little bit circuitously in that I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and that at the time was considered the furniture city. And so we had major furniture manufacturers in the area, one of them being Steelcase, but there was Herman Miller and Tyndall and John Whitcomb. So I was keenly aware of design from kind of day one. And when I moved out to New York, I got a master's in decorative arts, because that decorative arts includes furniture. And then eventually really found my way to architecture history through some of my academic tours. And one of them is called the Victorian Society in London, where it's 3 weeks of studying their primarily 19th century architecture. And it was one of those aha moments for me. And I realized that I really wanted to then focus on architecture, and I went on and got a doctorate then. And interestingly enough, I studied under Kevin Murphy. He was my professor, and obviously now my collaborator. So that was my trajectory.
That's pretty cool. Did you stick with sort of academic architectural history? Have you done, what was the career?
Well, there was a period of time.
I
mean, I've had various jobs along the ways. And so I think one of the things that helped me was I had been an editor at Antiques Magazine for 4 years. And we obviously covered architecture stories, but I think it was there that I really refined my ability to probe and research and write. So it was the combination of that and the passion that led me back to get my doctorate, with a very specific intention of wanting to write books about architecture.
Great. Kevin, how about yourself?
Well, I was just going to say, before I knew Marianne as a student, I had in my filing cabinet for years one of her articles on the Reform Club in London that I used in my teaching. So I knew her by reputation, and that was an Antiques Magazine article. So, but anyway, I grew up north of Boston in the town of Boxford, which was a very tiny little place when I was growing up, but there was a lot of construction happening at that time. And so I spent lots of time like exploring buildings that were under construction. I got interested in architecture. And then we went to Maine every summer, and we had a house in York, Maine, in southern Maine, which is known for having a number of important historic buildings. So I had that interest in in architecture and history from a really young age. And then when I went to college, I kind of discovered that there was a discipline called art history, and I became an art history major. And then after that, I was very interested in preservation. I actually got my master's degree in preservation at Boston University. And I worked in historic preservation, doing, like National Register nominations and surveys. And it was at a time when there was a ton of certified rehabilitation of historic buildings in Boston, particularly in the South End. And so I worked as a consultant to developers who were doing those kinds of projects. And then I decided to go on and get my PhD. And as an undergrad, I'd spent a semester in France at Grenoble. And so I had French, pretty good French. And so I went to Northwestern, and I was going to do an American topic for my dissertation. Then it was at a moment in the mid to late 80s when French art and architecture was a really exciting field, and there were a lot of people at Northwestern doing that, and I already had French. So I ended up doing a French topic that built on my background in preservation. I wrote about the restoration of medieval buildings in 19th century France. And I've continued to write about French art and architecture while I also continue to be interested in American things as well.
Well, I think what's always interesting.
Can I just add a little bit that Kevin also, with your interest in Viollet-le-Duc and how you've commented, your recent comments on Notre Dame?
Yeah, recently I went back to my work on Notre Dame of Paris, which was part of my dissertation that I actually never published. And then after the fire, I wrote a short book, which kind of offers for a lay reader the whole history of Notre Dame in a very digestible form, I hope.
Well, that sounds like thank you for jumping in with that, Marianne. Like, I think that would make for a great other episode of PreserveCast. So we'll have to have you back for that. I think there would be a lot of interest in that. Mm-hmm. And what I was going to say is that, I mean, the circuitous route to careers is a through line in every episode of PreserveCast. It doesn't seem like anybody just wakes up one day and decides they're going to be a preservationist or architectural historian. And I think that that's encouraging for people listening who perhaps are thinking about a second career or sort of changing where they're headed or recalibrating. So there's a lot of positivity and promise in stories like these. For people who aren't familiar with the book, we're going to really dive into that, which is Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism. And we're going to put a link in the show notes so people can pick the book up and purchase it. It really is. It's interesting. It spans something between academic treatise and just very visually beautiful, something that's really approachable. And so I think it's a great piece for people to take a look at. But tell me, where does and either of you who want to jump in on this one, where did the kernel of the idea come from to publish something like this on this specific aspect of American modernism?
We can both answer it. Yeah, I know. We can both answer it. I'll start. When I was taking a class with Kevin, It was actually a seminar, and it was called Domesticity and Architecture. And I went to see him, and he suggested I write a seminar paper on she's an architect, Ethel Brown Power. Ethel Brown Power was editor of House Beautiful between 1923 and 1933. And in her life partner was an architect that Kevin was really interested in, and we both are now, Eleanor Raymond, who's one of the few women architects really recognized with a public record at the Graduate School of Design and the Archives. And Ethel Power, it turns out, through her editorship at House Beautiful, really promoted modernism and introduced her readers very gently and very cautiously to the concepts of modernism that these two women had seen in Europe when they traveled in the 20s abroad. And then what we began to see, and we pulled this out even more in our book, is the collaboration between the editor and the architect was immensely more influential than we had ever even imagined. And together, I think they had a lot of power and influence over other women architects. And their contribution, I think, we're just recognizing now through our book.
So my I'm being originally from the Boston area, and my parents both grew up near Boston or in Boston. My father grew up in Cambridge, and when I was in my first teaching job, which was in the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, we had a master's student named Mary Pope Furr, who wrote her thesis on the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, which was basically in Harvard Square, and it was a women's architecture school. And none of us who were readers of this had really any knowledge of it. And what really interested me, and so I went to Mary Pope. I said, "Do you mind if I pursue your work on this building?" And she said, "Okay." Was the school building that they constructed in 1928, which was actually this kind of like factory-like drafting wing that they added to an 18th century house, which I thought was really fascinating. And the drafting wing was incredibly modern, but here it was stuck onto this like vernacular 18th century house. So, I started working on that kind of off and on. I kept working on it, and I published an article in the Journal of Society of Architectural Historians about it. And then after Mary Ann published her first book on Edward Durell Stone, I like to invoke this evening in her apartment in New York with her husband, where she was saying, like, "Well, what should I do my next book on?" And I said, "Well, why don't you write about these women who went to the Cambridge School?" And she said, "Well, why don't we do it together?" And so that was about, I don't even want to think about how many years ago, but it was a lot of years ago.
Well, I just looked back this morning, actually. Do you know the paper that I wrote for your class was 25 years ago?
Oh, my gosh. Wow. So it was a long process.
I mean, it comes across in that it is in depth and it's comprehensive. And I think it's interesting in the way that it approaches gender as well as sort of shifts in modernism and what modernism meant to different peoples, both sort of the aesthetic, but then the form, and how women brought a different take on form, or perhaps even prioritized it because they wanted the spaces to work better than not just be perhaps visually stark and things like that. And that comes across in the design, which it never really occurred to me. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but it never actually occurred to me. And it was sort of like an aha moment for me when I read that part and thought, oh, that's truly fascinating. But, I guess we sort of jumped ahead. We have a lot of different listeners in a lot of different places. And not everyone may be totally familiar with what we mean when we say modernism, because they're like, well, isn't everything just modern? For if it's current. But what's the simplest way? And maybe we'll toss this one to Marianne. What is the simplest way of defining modernism? And then we can kind of talk maybe a little bit about, and obviously you'd have to buy the book to get the full story, but we'll talk a little bit about how what you uncovered in sort of women in their impact on modernism. But how do we define it? What is a good way of kind of thinking about it?
Okay, well, I think so. Modernism, I think is not just it's an artistic and it's an architectural and it's a cultural movement that I think largely the way we see it is it started abroad and actually was brought here or very influential here and increasingly so after World War II or beginning in the late 1930s. And I think it was a reaction against, at least in this country, it was a reaction to historical traditions. And it was also wanting to take advantage of new materials, new technologies, new ideas that were emerging. And in this country, it took I think, quite a different form, ultimately, than it did in Europe. Because here, what you see in the late 1930s, as you start to see it, you see the austerity and the severe forms merge with a more humanistic and comfortable aesthetic that also incorporated some of the historical features in historical houses and also some of the environmental. It took advantage or quoted the surrounding environments often, say in use of the colors in nature. Kevin, can you expand?
Yeah, I mean, when you asked us for a simple explanation of modernism, I kind of shuddered because I think what recent scholarship has shown is that there is no singular or simple approach to modernism. However, I mean, I think we can say that, to Marianne's point, that it was a sensibility, a broad cultural sensibility about wanting to make new cultural forms that corresponded to what was perceived to be a new age. And so, it was really in the 1860s that, modernity, for example, began to be used, famously by the poet Charles Baudelaire in Paris to describe a kind of, way of life that was totally different than everything that had come before it. So, I mean, in a very basic sense, it's what the impulse to make things that were responsive to this new situation. As Marianne says, it's, responding to new materials or, new technologies, new forms of life, and so on. So, I mean, but to your question, initially, when we started working on this project, we were trying to think, well, what is the particular modernism that these women were advocating for? And so, as Marianne points out, in many cases, it's a modernism that doesn't, dispense with all of history, but tries to build upon aspects of tradition. Often that's vernacular tradition. The women we look at were absolutely fascinated with some of the leading modernists of Europe, Le Corbusier, Gropius, especially after he came to the U.S., André Lersa, other Europeans, your modernist architects in the Low Countries and so on. Many went to see that work. They traveled, many of them, as we say in the book, traveled to Mexico to look at both traditional and modernist architecture there by Juan O'Gorman and other architects of the 20s and 30s. So they were, very much engaged in European international modernism, also in vernacular tradition. And there's this interesting thing, right? That on the one hand, as you said, these women are often credited with being particularly, especially practical when it came to house design in a way that men weren't. And were very interested in function, but part of that was also that they weren't expected to develop signature styles, like a Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, or other contemporaries, right? So they weren't like, it wasn't like they were being trained to go out and indulge their aesthetic philosophies and fancies and become star architects in the way that we think of them today. Their expectations as practitioners was that they would respond to the needs of their clients. And so, there are quite a few women we talk about. Karina Mulligan comes to mind, who was a New Haven architect, who did these very, very modern houses, and then she did very traditional ones. And she was just totally adept at responding to what her clients needed, the opposite of what Frank Lloyd Wright is renowned for having done.
Well, can I just add for a second one piece to this, which comes to my mind? So they're so intrigued with this new modern aesthetic and concepts together. And they were responding to their moment in time. Now, many of them could not get jobs in the large architecture firms because they were women, or they could not get beyond the initial job of being on the drafting board. But because of that, then they with their interest, they responded to their own current situation. And so, for example, one of our women architects moved into a home and found out, wow, I want to make a modern interior, but there's no furniture. There's nothing here that I can afford. Now, at that time, there was some Alto furniture being produced here, but a little bit by some other architects that were being produced, but it was all too expensive. So she started a firm to make inexpensive, functional, comfortable furniture that looked at, some of the masters, but was, more, she looked at the masters, but it was geared towards her peers and people who could afford and lived in small apartments. So that's one example. There are many examples where, based on their own experiences, that they went home and used modernism to create some form of art. And oftentimes it wasn't architecture.
So I guess maybe the one...
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
For your listeners who have seen The Brutalist, the film, there's, when he first arrived, the main character, the architect, when he arrives in the U.S. and he's living with his brother and sister-in-law in Philadelphia, the first thing he does is produce modern furniture and put it in their furniture store window, which I thought was very apt, because it's a situation that, and Marianne in particular knows better than I do, that there was this gap in the availability of modern furnishing that women were able to be more accepted in than just purely architects.
No, I think that's a good point and a good connection to something sort of out there in the public domain right now. So let me ask you this, and I mean, I guess this kind of directly leads into the whole point of the book, but how would you define, or what would you suggest, or the broad strokes of the contributions of women to modern architecture? I mean, what changed about modern architecture because of the female involvement in it, that perhaps the field of architectural history has overlooked to this point? What do you feel like is really sort of a defining character or characters of modern architecture that this book is sort of elevating and bringing out? What do you feel like is the big big piece of it? And I don't know if Mary Ann, you want to jump in here, and then we can go over to Kevin.
That's a really good question. I don't want to put women, in a box and say that because they were women, they were, appropriate for they were geared towards domesticity and domestic design. In fact, but on the other hand, I think that women really were able to contribute to enhance modernism in the interiors. But it's not just in the furniture, but it's in the way the house functioned. And some of the time we found it was also in the way that they created a space for themselves. And, how they could work and take care of the children while at the same time talk to a client in their kitchen or have a little space that they reserve for themselves. So I think that's one area where they were particularly strong.
So even sort of physically carving out spaces for them to have a space in there. And I know you call out one example too in the book of, and I can't remember the architect's name. I'm sure you will immediately remember it since you've worked on this for so long. But the woman who has the cabin that is not, and it has modern implications and in its design, but it's a vernacular type, and so somebody might pass by that, driving down the road and just think, well, it's just an old cabin. But it has sort of a modernist design and approach using vernacular.
Well, it's not even somebody tools. Driving by, but the archives are in Radcliffe, and her design for the house and her files for that house have been passed by historians for decades because they were focused on her. It's Florence Luscombe, and they were focused on her suffrage work, and they completely missed, more or less, or they would just mention, oh, and by the way, she had an architecture degree from MIT. And no one really wrote much about her cabin at all. Yet we see the cabin as a complete and total expression of her whole suffrage concepts and thoughts and relationships. Evan, do you want to go on?
Yeah, I was going to say, I started laughing when you said someone driving down the road. But in fact, it's like in the middle of the woods, and it's half destroyed by neglect. And I really have to give a lot of credit to Mary Ann, who's the most dogged hunter down of things you'll ever find. And, we went up, it's in New Hampshire. We went up to New Hampshire and we're like, oh, it's probably gone. It's probably demolished. And, Mary Ann says, no, we should walk back in the woods. And there it was. So not only would you ignore it driving by, but you would have to go to great lengths to find it. But it's incredibly well documented. And it's a really good example of a kind of modernism that lacks many of the things we would think of as modern. But in fact, she was incredibly intentional about every square inch of this little cabin and how she was going to maximize the space in there for herself and for her friends, because it was very much conceived of as a retreat for her kind of circle of progressive friends in the Boston area.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good sort of just point in that, the thrust of this podcast is around preservation and understanding history and how we then turn that into action and preserve place. And I think that point about it being, lost. I mean, obviously the direct implication is there that it's not being preserved, but also it's a charge for preservationists to think about those places and even the form of those places, how we document them, and then how we move to protect and preserve places like that. And, I think for far too long, the preservation community sort of dragged its feet on modernism in general. And, we're paying the price for that. And, so I think it's just important to kind of highlight that for the preservation community to think about as well.
I also think it's important to look at buildings that maybe aren't as glamorously modern as the Gropius House or something, but nonetheless represent a body of modernist practice that was influential and that really changed the look of the landscape. When you initially posed this question, I was thinking about this Karina Milligan in New Haven, or she had counterparts in Vermont and Delaware, Victorine DuPont Holmesy, and others, Ruth Reynolds Freeman in Burlington, Vermont. Architects who were really invested in modernism moved to places where there was not established, modern architecture culture, and really made it known and played an important role in, introducing new ideas about design to places where they were not very familiar. And I should just say that the record of that is not necessarily in glamorous, fantastically huge, beautiful buildings, but can be in in certain ways, very modest buildings that are trying to accommodate themselves to the built environment that exists.
Well, and this leads into one of our final chapters, which is on women's singular buildings, because they weren't doing signature architecture. Oftentimes, they only had a chance once or twice to design something for themselves or their family. We saw that multiple times. And what was so, and we write about it, but what was so amazing is in our research, we were finding these buildings. Some of them were barely standing, some of them had been transitioned or transformed, but the point is, they're still out there as these one-offs or these examples of early modernism that are just thrilling. And can I just say, it's not just the women, but it's some of the men too. For example, in Michigan, outside of Zeeland, Michigan, Herman Miller, there is a house designed by Charles Ames. And he, I think, designed like one or two other houses. He wasn't a house designer at the end of the day. He did it for the president of Herman Miller. It's sitting on this street of, 1940s Sears and Roebuck houses, basically. And all of a sudden you come across this piece of modernism. And now Herman Miller owns it, but I don't think they know what to do with it. But at least it's owned and it's safe. But there are these all over the country still. And I found that with my research with this, and I found it with the research with Edward Durell Stone. Same thing. And it's thrilling to find these pieces. And I would think that they're in every community that your listeners live in.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a call to action for preservationists to think about that and document not only documentation, but then action and how we protect and preserve these places and recognize them for what they are. I guess though maybe one question before we kind of move to a conclusion here, but is, implicit or implied in all of this is these were groundbreaking female architects in the sense that this was a moment in time that women were breaking into workforces all across the country, not just architecture, but certainly architecture and certainly these professional fields that had a lot of big barriers up. Obviously, your book and others, but yours in particular, are attempting to correct the record and show how this process worked. But, would you go so far as to say that they were part of the reason that women are able to practice architecture today? Are these did they break the ground, open spaces, break that glass ceiling? Is this part of that story for architecture?
Okay. Well, yes and no. So yes, they were groundbreaking. A lot of, read about many stories where a firm had never had a woman architect before, or they didn't know quite what to do with them. Um, but I would also say the ceiling is not broken yet. And I don't think architecture is unique to that. We don't just, I think about gender as a barrier in our book. We also think a little bit about class and about race, because there are a couple of African American architects who are included, and clearly the barriers that they faced were even more complicated to negotiate around. And we know that all of those identities are still things that are complicated to negotiate in the workplace, not just in architecture, but in any place. And we're in a moment where there's a lot of skepticism about whether anything needs to be done about it. But in fact, I think what our story shows is that there's this kind of legacy of inequality that we're still dealing with.
Do you want to add to
And
that,
there's
Marianne?
still a number of women organizations that are focused on, the missing piece of women in the architecture world even today. So it's still an issue. It's not equal.
Oh yeah, no, and I didn't mean to suggest that, but I think that's a good.
But it is more equal with education. See, and we start, when in the 1930s, women weren't even allowed into Harvard to study. And it's become there's a greater presence and equality of women in the graduate schools in architecture and landscape architecture than there were previously. So that's progress.
Well, I think that if anything, we've shown through this conversation that the book is fascinating, approaches the story from a lot of different directions, and is definitely worth a read. So we'd encourage people who work in the field of preservation, work in the field of architectural history. It's time to pick up this book. Again, the title is Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism. And we've been talking with the authors, Marianne Hunting and Kevin Murphy. And so, before we go, we love to get to know a couple other things, which is, what are you working on next? Because I know, Marianne, you said you went and got your PhD so you could write books. So I presume this is probably not the last one. And then want to hear the same thing from Professor Murphy. But Marianne, why don't you jump in there first? What can we expect next?
Well, we kind of have this related but an interest in a woman developer, Helena Osborne Storrow. She was the woman who gave the money and the land initially for Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer and Walter Bogner to build their modern houses in the 1930s in Lincoln, Massachusetts. People have focused on these houses. They're iconic, but nobody ever talked about why the developer gave the money to begin with and what was her background. And there are other developers out there like her who were supporting community developments and many of them with either modern buildings or modern aspects. So we have just written a chapter for another book on this woman, and I think there's a lot more to be said about her and her colleagues. So that's sort of where I'm shifting right now.
Fascinating. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah. So in the midst of the book being in its final throes of production, I curated last year with a group of students an exhibition of the work of Russell Cheney, who was a painter. He was born in the 1880s and died in the 40s. And his life partner was a man named F.O. Matheson, who's a famous scholar at Harvard, who's known as kind of the father of American studies in literature. And they lived on Beacon Hill in Boston. And I was like doing some research about this, and I found out that they lived in the same building as a building where Eleanor Raymond, one of her architects, had actually done a couple of projects for a friend of hers. And they lived up the street from Eleanor Raymond, who lived at the foot of Beacon Hill with her partner, Ethel Power. So I got very interested in thinking about Beacon Hill as a neighborhood of, particularly of kind of bohemian, gay and lesbian, artists and, visual artists, architects, writers, and so on in the like 1940s and 1950s. So I've been kind of thinking about that.
Well, the diversity of interests in both of you is fascinating and exciting to hear about the things that are coming. We always ask, it's a painful question for most people, their favorite historic place or site. And we normally let people off easy and they can tell us the most recent one if they struggle about the absolute favorite. But we'll start with Kevin and then go over to Marianne.
Yeah, I got a preview of this question yesterday. I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? There's so many. But I will say that a building that I visited not long ago, but still captivates me is the house E1027, which was designed by Charlotte Perriot for herself and her lover, Jean Benevici, the architectural editor. It's in the south of France, and it's you can visit it. It's now a historic site, but it's just a spectacular early modern house of the 1920s, and Corbusier famously lived right next door in a kind of uninvited painted a mural on the wall of E1027. It's a really fascinating story, and for a long time, Perriot wasn't even accredited with the design of the house, but in fact, it was her design. It's really just gorgeous, and so that kind of stands out in my mind.
Great, Marianne.
The absolute most recent was just last week when we had our book launch at the Lever House on Park Avenue in New York. That was built in 1952 as pretty much one of the first international style building in New York City, or not on Park Avenue certainly. And it was designed by Skidmore Owens Merrill under the partner Gordon Bunshaft. But one of the women that we write about, Natalie DeBlas, is also worked on that project, which is why we chose that space. This space is absolutely thrilling. And to be able to have our launch in that space, it went beyond my expectation of what it could be like, because it's so dramatic and such an important example of modernism that went through years of struggle and different owners to survive.
Well, it's a great place to end the story, because it pulls it all together: women architects, beautiful architecture, and preservation, and the struggle to save these places, which I think will be aided by this book. So I'm so glad that we were able to have you with us. Again, we'll have a link in the show notes so people can pick this up and learn more about it, and learn more about these two wonderful authors that we've had with us today. So thank you so much, Marianne and Kevin, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.